At my son's engagement dinner, I handed him an envelope I'd been saving for 31 years. He laughed, passed it to his fiancée without opening it, and she set it on the edge of the table, like it was a flyer from a pizza place. His future mother-in-law leaned over, glanced at the return address on the envelope and said, "Oh, is that from one of those credit union accounts? How sweet!" My son didn't correct her. He just smiled and said, "Mom's always been careful with her pennies." The table laughed. I didn't. The next morning, I drove to my branch on Wellington Street. The teller looked at my account number, typed something, looked again, and then quietly asked me to wait while she got the branch manager. I wasn't upset when I sat down in that office. I was ready. I need to back up. I'm 64 years old. I've worked as a hospital housekeeper for the better part of 3 decades. Royal Victoria in Montreal before it closed, then a transfer to a facility in Ottawa when my son was still in school. I mopped floors on the overnight shift while he slept. I packed his lunches in the morning after getting home at 6. I wore the same winter coat for 11 years because the money I wasn't spending on myself was going somewhere else. Somewhere he never knew about. His name is my whole heart. I won't pretend otherwise. He was a quiet, serious boy who turned into a quiet, serious man, and I was proud of every version of him. When he called to tell me he was proposing to his girlfriend, I cried in the parking lot of a Loblaws. Good tears. The kind you save up. Her family is from Westmount. Old money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself because it doesn't have to. Her mother collects art. Her father sits on 3 boards. They had the engagement dinner at a restaurant in Old Montreal where the menu didn't have prices, which tells you everything. I wore my good blazer. I took a cab because I didn't want to look for parking. I brought the envelope. 31 years ago, I opened a savings account at a credit union on Saint Laurent with $412. Everything I had after my husband left. I set up an automatic transfer of $200 a month, and I never touched it. When I got a raise, I increased the transfer. When the credit union merged and became something else, I moved the account. When the interest rates shifted, I moved again. I never withdrew $1. Not once. Not when the furnace broke. Not when my son needed braces. Not when I had a winter so bad I was eating crackers and peanut butter for dinner, because I'd put everything else toward a property on Gladstone Avenue that everyone told me was a terrible investment. I bought that property in 1997 for $62,000. I fixed the plumbing myself from a library book. I rented it to a young couple, a nursing student, and her husband who drove transit. I used the rent to buy a duplex in Vanier 4 years later, then a triplex. I kept working nights. I kept mopping floors. Nobody at work knew. Nobody in my building knew. My son certainly didn't know. He thought I was careful with my pennies. The envelope I brought to that dinner held a card with a handwritten note explaining that I wanted to give him something real. Not a kitchen appliance or a gift card, but the account number and a folder of documents from an account I'd been building since before he could read. I'd planned to explain it over dessert. I never got the chance. His future mother-in-law had already moved on to talking about venues. His fiancée was showing someone a photo on her phone, and my son had slid the envelope off the table into his jacket pocket with the same energy you'd use to pocket a receipt you're not sure you need. I drove home alone. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My building is a converted Victorian on Bronson. I own it. Though the only people who know that are my accountant and a property management firm called Cardinal Properties. I've lived in the ground floor unit for 22 years. I could live anywhere. I choose this. I looked at my walls. I thought about what my son had said. Careful with her pennies. I wasn't angry yet. I was something quieter than that. I was measuring. The next morning, I drove to Wellington Street and sat across from the branch manager. She had a firm handshake and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she did not blink when she pulled up my file. She went very still for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Beaumont, I'd like to bring in our wealth management advisor if that's all right with you." I said that was fine. The balance in that account, with 31 years of compound interest and reinvested dividends, was $419,000. Not millions. This is real life, not a fairy tale, and I want to be honest about that. But $419,000 saved on a housekeeper's wage, never touched, was enough to make a woman in a good suit sit forward in her chair. The advisor, a man named, well, it doesn't matter what his name was, he asked me what I wanted to do with the funds. I told him I needed to think. I also told him I wanted to understand what my complete asset picture looked like. All of it. The savings account, the properties, the stocks I'd bought through a discount brokerage over the years when everyone said it was too risky for someone in my position. He spent 40 minutes pulling it together. Then he turned the screen toward me and said quietly, "You have approximately $2.3 million in total assets, not counting the primary residence." I'd known the number roughly. Hearing someone else say it was different. I thanked him, took the folder, and walked back out through the marble lobby into a gray November morning in Ottawa. A city bus went by. I'd taken that route for I didn't call my son. Not yet. I went home and I thought about what I'd actually seen at that dinner. Not what I'd felt, what I'd seen. His fiancée hadn't been cruel, exactly. She'd been indifferent. She'd looked at an envelope from her future mother-in-law and put it at the edge of the table like it wasn't worth her attention, because in her world, it probably wasn't. Her mother had made a joke about credit unions. My son had called me careful with my pennies and smiled while people laughed. What bothered me most was that he hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked embarrassed or apologetic afterward. He'd just moved on. I thought about the years, the overnight shifts, the packed lunches, the coat I wore for 11 years, the crackers and peanut butter winters. I had done all of it for him, and he had handed my envelope to his fiancée, like it was a mild inconvenience. I needed to understand something. So I called a woman I'd used before, not a private investigator exactly, but a financial researcher who'd help me with due diligence on properties. Her name isn't important. What matters is she was discreet and thorough, and she called me back within 48 hours. What she found wasn't criminal. I want to be clear about that. But it was illuminating. My son's fiancée's family wasn't as solid as they appeared. The art collection was leveraged. The father's board positions were advisory. It's mostly unpaid. There were 2 civil judgments in Quebec court records, both settled but neither small. The Westmount address was a rental. They had the appearance of money, the way some people have the appearance of confidence, maintained carefully, from a distance. My son was a project manager at a construction firm. He made a decent salary. But the lifestyle his fiancée expected, the restaurant where the menus had no prices, the venue discussions that assumed no ceiling on budget, the offhand talk of a honeymoon in the Maldives, none of that matched what 2 people their age could actually afford without substantial help from somewhere. From me, presumably. I sat with this for several days. I'm not someone who makes decisions quickly. I went to work. I mopped floors. I ate supper at my kitchen table and watched the street through my ground floor window. I thought about what kind of mother I wanted to be and what kind of person I'd raised. Then I called Cardinal Properties and asked them to send me all the documentation on the building. My son's fiancée's family was renting in Westmount. Cardinal manages 11 of my 12 properties. I already knew the answer before they called back, but I needed to hear it said out loud. Her family was renting from me. Had been for 6 years. They didn't know. Of course they didn't know. PC Cardinal Holdings doesn't advertise who owns it. I'm not in the habit of announcing myself. But 6 years of her family living in a property I owned, 6 years of her father's checks arriving in my account every month while her mother made jokes about credit unions at my expense. I made myself a cup of tea. I looked out the window. A child was riding a bike on the sidewalk in the November cold, mittens bright red against the gray street. I picked up the phone and called my son. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail, so I said I wanted to have lunch, just the 2 of us, and that I had some things I wanted to share with him about the envelope from the dinner. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. He texted back 4 hours later. Can't do lunch this week. Things are crazy with the wedding planning. Maybe after Christmas? After Christmas. I looked at that text for a while. Then I put the phone face down on the table. The wedding was in February. Chateau Laurier, which is as Ottawa as it gets. A castle on the river, limestone and copper roof and all of it. $7,000 for the ballroom rental alone. I knew the number because the venue coordinator had emailed me a copy of the contract by mistake. I'm on my son's emergency contact list, which means I occasionally receive things meant for other people. I hadn't mentioned it. I just filed the email away. The Chateau Laurier, as it happens, is not a property I own. I want to be accurate. But the catering company they'd contracted was a firm called Rideau Table, and Rideau Table operates out of a commercial kitchen unit in a building on Sparks Street that Cardinal Holdings manages on my behalf. I'm not suggesting this was fate. I'm saying the city is smaller than people think. I attended the wedding. I wore my good blazer again. The same. I sat near the back on the groom's side because my son had arranged the seating, and my table was next to the service entrance, which I found clarifying in ways he probably didn't intend. His future mother-in-law gave a toast. She talked about the family her daughter was marrying into. She was gracious in the way that some people are gracious when they feel entirely secure. Generously from height. She mentioned my son's ambition. She mentioned the life they were building. She did not mention me, though I was 15 feet away. My son's toast mentioned his fiancée 6 times, and his mother once, at the end, briefly, in a list with other people who had supported him. After dinner, his new wife's father found me at my table. He was a big man, pink-faced from the wine, expansive in the way that people are when they feel they're doing someone a favor by talking to them. He asked what I did. I told him I worked in healthcare facilities management. He nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already thought. He told me his daughter was a lucky girl to be joining such a hard-working family. Then he excused himself. I watched him walk back toward the head table. He had no idea that the building his family lived in belonged to the woman he'd just condescended to. I drove home alone again. I sat at my kitchen table again. It was late, and the street was quiet, and I thought about what I was going to do next. I called Cardinal Properties in the morning. I told them I'd be making some changes to the portfolio. First, I wanted to accelerate the sale of the Westmount property, list it within 60 days. Second, I wanted the proceeds from that sale directed toward a project I'd been considering for a while, converting 2 of my Vanier properties into affordable rental units with subsidized rates for healthcare workers and tradespeople. I'd been putting it off because it was complicated and expensive. I didn't want to put it off anymore. The man at Cardinal said, "That's a significant decision. Are you sure?" I told him I'd never been more sure of anything. My son didn't call for 3 weeks after the wedding. When he did, it was a Sunday evening, and his voice had a quality I recognized from when he was a teenager, and something had gone wrong at school. A careful, contained quality, like he was carrying something breakable. He said his in-laws were being asked to move, that the building had sold, and the new owners weren't renewing the lease. That it was a shock because they'd been there for years and assumed they were settled. That his wife was upset. He paused. He said, "Mom, I don't suppose you know anything about the property market in Westmount." I said, "I know a little about property." Another pause. He said, Do you own things? Like property things?" I told him I'd been investing in Ottawa real estate since 1997, that I currently managed a portfolio of 12 properties, that the Westmount address his in-laws had been renting was among them, because I don't generally discuss my holdings. The silence on the other end of the phone was very long. Then he said, "Mom, the envelope." "Yes, I never opened it." "I know." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The careful, contained quality was gone. He sounded younger. He sounded like he had at 12 years old, coming home from school to find I'd worked a double shift and there was a meal on the stove anyway, and he hadn't understood until much later what that had cost. He said, "Can I come over?" I said yes. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten crackers and peanut butter, where I'd watched the street through the window, where I'd made every quiet decision that had led to this moment. And he opened the envelope. He read the note I'd written. He looked at the account number and the folder of documents. He looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. He said, "You did this on a housekeeper's salary." I said, "I did this on a housekeeper's salary." He put the papers down. He looked at his hands. He said, "I called you careful with your pennies in front of everyone, and you just sat there." I told him I'd been sitting with a lot of things for a long time. That it wasn't about the money, not really. That what I'd needed to know was who he was when he thought I was nobody. Whether the son I'd raised was still in there, or whether he'd decided to become someone else. He asked what he could do. I told him to start by reading the envelope. Actually reading it this time. He spent 2 hours at my table going through everything. I made tea. I didn't explain much. The documents explained themselves. At one point, he asked about the Vanier properties, the ones I was converting. I told him what I was doing with them. Healthcare workers, tradespeople, people who keep cities running and can't afford to live in them anymore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his wife's cousin was a PSW who'd been trying to find a place in Ottawa for almost a year. I told him to have her fill out an application like everyone else. He almost smiled. That's fair. It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in a while. We didn't fix everything that night. That's not how it works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. His wife was hurt and confused about the Westmount property, and that was going to take time. His in-laws were going to have to find somewhere else to live, and they weren't going to be gracious about it. There was a version of all this that exploded badly, and I knew that, but my son sat at my table for 2 hours, and he read every page, and when he left, he hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the sideways shoulder touch he'd been doing for years. And he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I made you invisible." That was enough. Not everything, but enough for now. The affordable units opened that June. 8 apartments in Vanier, good bones, new insulation, fresh paint. I didn't go to any ceremony. There wasn't one. Families just got their keys and moved in. A woman who worked nights at the Montfort showed up with her daughter and 2 garbage bags of belongings and stood in the kitchen of her new apartment for a long time without saying anything. I heard about it from Cardinal Properties in a weekly report. That's fine. I didn't need to be there for it to be real. My son calls now. Not constantly, not every week, but regularly, in a way he hadn't for years before all of this. He asks about the properties sometimes. Not because he wants anything, but because he's curious, the way you get curious about something you'd looked at without seeing. Last month, he asked if I'd ever thought about what I'd do with the portfolio eventually. I said I'd thought about it. He said he'd been thinking about it too. I told him thinking was a good start. The savings account, the $419,000, is still there, in his name now as beneficiary, documented and proper. I didn't give it to him. I didn't take it back. I just made sure the paperwork was clear, so that when the time comes, there's no question about what it is or where it came from. It came from 31 years of overnight shifts on Wellington and Bronson and corridors that smelled like bleach and rubber floors. It came from the coat I wore for 11 years, and the crackers and peanut butter winters, and every property that everyone said was a terrible investment. It came from a woman who mopped floors and built something. He knows that now. That's what I needed him to know.